Some choices change everything. Some mistakes, they don't just fade with time. They don't disappear. They live inside you, replaying in the quiet moments, whispering in your ear when you least expect it. It's been 2 years. 2 years since that night. 2 years since I crossed a line I never thought I would. And yet, every time I close my eyes, I see it. I feel it. The way the air was thick with something unspoken. The way my heart pounded, warning me, begging me to stop. But I didn't. I tell myself I didn't mean for it to happen. That it was never supposed to go that far. That I was just trying to help. But the truth? The truth is messier than that. It always is. So let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where everything you thought you knew, everything you believed about yourself, started to slip through your fingers? Where right and wrong blurred into something else, something dangerous? What would you do if you were faced with a temptation so strong, so undeniable, that it threatened to pull you under? Because that's what happened to me. And once you step over that line, there's no going back. I never set out to be the kind of woman who makes mistakes like this. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have laughed at the idea. Me? A woman who crosses boundaries? A woman who loses herself in something reckless? Never. But life has a way of unraveling you slowly, thread by thread, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. I'm 39. I've been married for over a decade. And for the past few years, I've felt like nothing more than a shadow in my own home. My husband, God, where do I even begin? He used to see me. Really see me. Back when we first met, I was everything to him. He'd pull me close in the kitchen just to kiss my neck, trace his fingers along my skin like I was something delicate, something worth holding onto. But that was a long time ago. Now, he's always busy, always exhausted, always distracted. Work, emails, meetings. I don't remember the last time he asked how my day was. I don't remember the last time he looked at me the way he used to. The way a man looks at a woman he wants. And maybe that's where it started, the loneliness. The quiet ache of being next to someone and still feeling completely alone. But this story isn't about him. Not really. It's about my stepson, Jake. He's in his early 20s now. I met him when he was just a kid, awkward, quiet, still figuring himself out. But time does something to people. It shapes them, molds them. And somewhere along the way, he became a man. A man who, whether I wanted to admit it or not, had started looking at me differently. Not in an obvious way. No, it was more subtle than that. A glance that lasted a second too long. The way his gaze would flicker away when I caught him staring. The way he'd hang on to my words like they meant more to him than they should. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading into things that weren't there. That I was lonely, and loneliness has a way of twisting reality. And then there was her. Emily. His girlfriend. Sweet girl. A little shy. A little unsure of herself. The kind of girl who still had this innocence about her, like she was trying to navigate the world without losing herself in it. She loved Jake. That much was obvious. But she was nervous about their relationship, about where things were going. About the fact that they hadn't taken that next step yet. I remember the first time she brought it up. It was late. The three of us were sitting on the patio, the air thick with summer heat, crickets humming in the distance. My husband was out of town on business, another trip, another excuse to be somewhere else. Emily looked at me with those wide, nervous eyes, biting her lip like she wasn't sure she should say what she was thinking. I don't know how to do it right, she finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. Do what right? Her cheeks flushed. She glanced at Jake, then back at me. You know, that. And just like that, something shifted. Jake looked uncomfortable, his jaw tightening, his fingers drumming against the table. Emily, on the other hand, was desperate for reassurance, for guidance, for someone to tell her that it was okay to be afraid. And me? I should have changed the subject. I should have told her it wasn't my place. But I didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, someone was looking at me like I had the answers. Like I mattered. So I stayed in that moment, let it stretch between us. And I had no idea that was the first step towards something I could never take back. I should have shut it down. Right then and there. I should have smiled politely, told Emily that some things are best figured out in their own time, that no one really knows what they're doing when it comes to love, that it's messy and awkward and no advice in the world can change that. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned in, elbows resting on the patio table, and met her eyes. "What are you afraid of?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. She glanced at Jake for reassurance, but he just looked away, suddenly fascinated by the condensation on his glass. Emily swallowed. I don't want to mess it up. I don't want him to be disappointed. Disappointed. That word hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I felt Jake tense beside me, the flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on the space between us. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The cicadas hummed in the distance, filling the quiet. I should have ended the conversation. I should have given her some simple, surface-level advice, told her that if they really cared about each other, everything would happen naturally. But something about the way she looked at me, so vulnerable, so unsure, so desperate to be told she was enough, it did something to me. Because I knew that feeling. I knew what it was like to doubt yourself, to wonder if you were enough for someone. I took a breath. "It's normal to feel that way," I said. "But the truth is, intimacy isn't about getting it perfect. It's about trust. It's about connection." I glanced at Jake as I said it. His eyes met mine for just a second, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. And then he looked away again, exhaling slowly, running a hand through his hair. Emily nodded, but her shoulders were still tight, still unsure. "What if I do something wrong?" she asked. "What if I make it weird?" A soft laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, shaking my head. "It's always weird at first. That's part of it." She relaxed a little, her lips curving into a small, sheepish smile. And that's when I felt it. Jake's eyes on me. Not just looking. Watching. It was quick. So quick that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. But I was paying attention. His gaze lingered on my face, then drifted lower, just for a second. Just long enough for the air between us to shift. I swallowed. I told myself I was imagining it. That it was nothing. That I was reading into something that wasn't there. But then Emily spoke again, and the moment snapped like a taut rubber band. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I forced myself to focus. "Of course." She hesitated, her fingers playing with the hem of her dress. "How did you know?" "When it was time. When you were ready." My breath caught in my throat. How did I know? I thought back to when I was younger, when I was her age, when I still believed in the kind of love that made your heart race, that made the world tilt on its axis. I thought about my husband. About how, back then, I couldn't get enough of him. How I used to wait for his touch, for the way he'd whisper my name like it was the only word that mattered. And then I thought about now. About the distance, the coldness, the way he barely even saw me anymore. My chest tightened. I turned my gaze to Jake without thinking, and he was already looking at me. Something twisted deep in my stomach. I knew, in that moment, that something had shifted between us. I just didn't know how far it would go. That night, I couldn't shake it. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the soft hum of the fan in the corner doing little to drown out the thoughts spinning in my mind. The conversation with Emily, the way she looked at me with that mix of trust and desperation, kept replaying over and over. But more than that, I kept going back to Jake. God, Jake. He was quiet, distant again, but it was different this time. His silence wasn't the usual avoidance I'd grown accustomed to. It felt like something else, something deeper. He had been watching me, really watching me, as if he could see through all the walls I had built around myself. And I hated that it felt like a relief. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not just as someone's wife or someone's stepmother, but as a woman. It wasn't supposed to feel good. It wasn't supposed to feel like a release. I should have been repulsed by the way his eyes lingered on me, by the way his gaze dipped and lingered longer than was socially acceptable. I should have felt disgusted, but instead, it stirred something deep inside me, something that I had long buried under the weight of a marriage that had lost its spark. I could feel the heat in my chest, the undeniable pull of a desire I hadn't felt in a long, long time. And it scared me. Was I imagining things? Had I read too much into a look that could have been nothing more than a momentary slip of the mind? A simple glance that didn't mean anything? Or had he been looking at me differently? The more I thought about it, the more my thoughts spiraled, tumbling over one another until they felt like they were suffocating me. I wanted to push it out of my mind, to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that I was overthinking things. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me like I was someone worth noticing, like I was someone worthy of desire. I hadn't felt that in so long. I hadn't felt like me in so long. It wasn't just about attraction. No, it was deeper than that. It was about the feeling of being wanted, of feeling special, of feeling important, even if only for a fleeting moment. I turned over, pulling the covers up higher as if it would shield me from the storm inside my head. But it didn't work. The guilt crept in slowly, wrapping itself around my chest like a heavy weight. I should feel guilty, shouldn't I? What kind of person feels this way? I wasn't supposed to be that woman. The one who had the thoughts I was having. The one who could allow herself to be consumed by the dangerous pull of something she knew she shouldn't want. But then there was that voice inside me. The one that whispered, "You're just trying to help. Just trying to help." Was it really so wrong to give advice? To offer guidance? I was just being a good stepmother. Just being a woman who saw someone struggling and wanted to make it better. Emily was nervous, unsure, and I knew what it was like to feel that way. I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? There was nothing wrong with being there for someone when they needed it, right? But my mind kept wandering back to the way Jake had looked at me. The way his eyes had lingered on my face. The way I'd caught him once, twice, his gaze drifting down to my lips before snapping back up to meet my eyes. I couldn't deny it. I couldn't pretend that it hadn't made me feel something. Something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the attention. It wasn't just about Jake wanting me in that way. No, it was something much more complicated. It was about the fact that, for the first time in a long time, someone had made me feel alive again. And that feeling? It was intoxicating. The guilt was there, sure. It was an old, familiar companion. But the desire, the pull of it, the sweetness of that forbidden attention, it was a whole different beast. I could feel the weight of it in every part of me. It was like a fire burning beneath my skin. "I'm just helping," I whispered to myself, repeating the words like a mantra. There's nothing wrong with a little guidance. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't just helping. I wasn't just offering advice. I was feeding something. Something I wasn't ready to admit. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the thoughts that were clawing at me. But they didn't go away. They lingered, darker now, more insistent. The worst part? I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that nothing was happening. The days that followed were different. I told myself nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. It was in the way Jake looked at me now, like he was seeing me in a way he hadn't before. Or maybe, I thought, maybe he had always seen me this way, and I had just refused to notice. Emily, sweet, trusting Emily, continued to confide in me. More and more, she sought me out, her questions becoming more intimate, more revealing. She would text me late at night, asking for advice. Small things at first, how to be more confident, how to make Jake feel comfortable. And then, slowly, her messages started to shift. How do you know what a guy really wants? How do you know when you're doing something right? I just want him to feel satisfied. Each time she asked, I could feel myself slipping further into something I wasn't sure I could pull myself out of. Jake, meanwhile, barely spoke at first. He was always there, always listening, his presence like a shadow that never strayed too far. And then, one night, everything blurred even more. It was late, almost midnight. Emily had stayed over. She was curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, sipping a glass of wine I had poured for her. Jake sat beside her, but there was space between them, a quiet tension in the air. I sat across from them, watching them both. She sighed, swirling the wine in her glass before looking at me. She hesitated, glancing at Jake before lowering her gaze. I feel like I'm holding us back. Like, I'm doing something wrong. Jake shifted beside her, his jaw tightening. He didn't look at me, but I could feel it, that same energy from before. The way his body stiffened, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest, restless, uncertain. Emily bit her lip. I just want to be good at it, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to know how to make it good for him. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. I should have told her she didn't need to worry. I should have reassured her that intimacy wasn't something to be perfected, that she didn't need to put this pressure on herself. But instead, I hesitated. And in that hesitation, something shifted. I set my glass down, exhaling slowly. Emily, I said gently, intimacy isn't about getting everything right. It's about confidence. It's about knowing what feels good and what doesn't. My voice trailed off as my eyes flickered to Jake. He was watching me now. Not just listening, watching. Emily nodded slowly, considering my words. But what if I don't know what feels good? She asked, her cheeks flushed, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hands. I swallowed. My throat was dry. She was trusting me. Jake was trusting me. And I was dangerously close to betraying that trust. I shifted in my seat, suddenly too aware of how close we all were, of how the air in the room had thickened with something I couldn't name. I needed to pull back. I needed to stop this before it went too far. But then, Emily reached out. It was innocent, just her fingers grazing my wrist as she spoke, a light touch meant to get my attention. But the moment her skin met mine, I felt it. So did Jake. Because when I looked up, his eyes weren't on Emily anymore. They were on me. And they weren't just looking. They were asking. The silence stretched. Too long. Too heavy. My pulse pounded in my ears. This was the moment. The moment I could still pull away. The moment I could laugh, shake my head, pretend none of this was happening. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stay. And in that silence, I made the first real mistake. I let myself enjoy it. The days that followed felt different. The shift had happened, and there was no pretending otherwise. Jake's eyes lingered too long now. Emily's questions became bolder. And me? I found myself waiting for the next moment. The next touch. The next accidental brush of fingers, the next lingering glance, the next shared silence where we all felt something we weren't supposed to feel. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. And the worst part? I didn't want it to end. It happened on a night like any other. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But I knew better. By then, the tension had become unbearable, stretched so thin between us that it felt like the slightest touch, the smallest push, would snap it completely. And that's exactly what happened. It was late. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. My husband was away again. Another business trip, another excuse, another night spent in a bed that no longer felt like mine. Emily had gone to bed earlier, exhausted after another long conversation over wine, her trust in me deepening, solidifying in ways that felt too heavy. She had asked me so many questions lately, so many things about relationships, about intimacy. But it wasn't Emily who haunted me. It was Jake. I knew he was still awake. I could feel it, even before I saw him. I was in the kitchen, my fingers wrapped around a glass of water, trying to drown out the thoughts that had been eating away at me. Trying to silence the voice that whispered, "You know what's happening. You know where this is going." And then I heard him. Soft footsteps. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. I should have told him to go back to bed. I should have left the kitchen, put a wall between us, anything to create distance before we crossed a line we couldn't come back from. But I didn't move. Neither did he. The air between us felt different tonight, heavier, charged with something I didn't want to name. He hesitated and then he stepped closer. My breath caught. This was it. The moment. A request, unspoken but understood. A line I should never cross. I should have turned away. I should have said his name, firmly, sternly, made it clear that this had gone far enough. But instead, I just stood there frozen. Because I wanted this. God help me, I wanted this. And when he reached for me, hesitant at first, waiting for any sign that I would pull away, I didn't stop him. His fingers brushed against mine, light as a whisper, and that was all it took. The last thread of restraint snapped. Everything after that was a blur. Heat. Desperation. Fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was wrong. I knew it. But the weight of guilt was no match for the overwhelming pull of feeling wanted again. I had forgotten what that felt like. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just someone's neglected wife. I wasn't just someone's afterthought. I was seen. I was needed. It didn't matter that it was wrong. It only mattered that, in that moment, it felt real. And then it was over. The room was still, the air thick with something neither of us dared to name. I felt his gaze on me, searching for something reassurance, maybe. An answer to a question neither of us had the courage to ask. But I couldn't look at him. Because the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me all at once. The reality. The mistake. The irreversible truth. My hands were shaking. My breath was uneven. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. A single thought echoed in my mind, relentless, suffocating. What have I done? Morning came too fast. I barely slept, twisting in the sheets, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a stone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, his hands, his lips, the way he looked at me afterward. The way neither of us spoke as the silence stretched between us, thick with something neither of us could name. Now, in the harsh light of day, finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake pushed back his chair and stood up abruptly. "I'm gonna take a shower," he mumbled. Emily barely reacted, nodding as she took another bite of toast. But I knew what that was. It was an escape. A way out. A way to avoid the truth that hung between us like a noose waiting to tighten. As soon as he disappeared down the hall, I exhaled shakily, pressing my palm against the cool surface of the counter, trying to steady myself. Emily glanced at me, frowning slightly. "He's been quiet all morning," she mused. "Do you think I did something wrong?" The words nearly made me choke. God. If only she knew. I shook my head quickly, forcing another weak smile. "No," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't do anything wrong." I did. I was the one who had broken something sacred. I was the one who had crossed the line. And now? Now, I had to live with it. The weight of guilt. I made it through the morning. Barely. Every second felt agonizing, like I was walking on a tightrope over an open pit, one wrong step away from losing everything. And then my husband came home. I heard the front door open, heard the rustle of bags being set down, the sound of his shoes scuffing against the floor. "Hey," he called from the doorway. "I'm back." For a moment, I couldn't move. Guilt clawed at my throat, raw and suffocating. I should have been relieved to see him, to have him back, to have someone pull me out of this nightmare I had created for myself. But instead, I felt like a fraud. I forced my legs to move, plastering on a smile that felt unnatural, stretched too tight over my face. "Hey," I greeted, stepping forward to kiss his cheek. The gesture felt foreign, forced, like I was playing a role I no longer knew how to perform. He barely glanced at me as he set down his bags, already reaching for his phone, checking his emails. As if nothing had changed. As if I wasn't a completely different person than I had been before he left. I watched him for a moment, waiting, searching for some kind of recognition, some sign that he knew, that he could sense the shift inside me. But there was nothing. Just the same tired man, lost in his work, unaware that his wife had shattered something sacred while he was gone. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking. I curled them into fists, forcing them to still, forcing myself to breathe. I had made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But what scared me the most, what terrified me, was the fact that some part of me, some dark, hidden part of me, wasn't just consumed by guilt. Some part of me was still craving it. Craving that feeling. Craving the way Jake had made me feel. And that was the real betrayal. I told myself it was a mistake. I told myself I would never let it happen again. I repeated the words over and over, hoping that if I said them enough times, they would solidify into truth. Hoping that if I willed it hard enough, the memory of that night would fade, slip away into some forgotten corner of my mind, never to resurface. But it didn't fade. It followed me, haunted me. It was in the way my body reacted every time Jake walked into the room. In the way my breath caught when I caught his scent, faint, clean, familiar. In the way my skin prickled when I felt his presence before I even saw him. The way I flinched when our hands accidentally brushed, not because I was repulsed, but because I wasn't. That was the real horror of it all. It wasn't just regret. It wasn't just guilt. It was the longing, the wanting, and that terrified me more than anything else. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, playing this scene over and over in my head. Each time, I tried to rewrite it. I tried to imagine myself pulling away. Imagine myself stopping before the moment had gone too far. Imagine myself choosing the right path, being the woman I was supposed to be. But every time I failed. Every time, my mind betrayed me. Because I didn't just relive the guilt. I relived the thrill. The way he looked at me. The way he hesitated, waiting for a sign. The way my body had answered for me. I should be ashamed. I was ashamed. But underneath the shame, beneath the guilt that coiled around my ribs like a tightening vice, there was something else. Something dark. A question I was too afraid to answer. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if some part of me wanted it to happen? I tried to go about my days as if nothing had changed. I cooked breakfast, cleaned the house, went grocery shopping, laughed when I was supposed to, smiled when it was expected. I let my husband kiss me on the forehead and pretend that everything was the same. But inside, I was unraveling. I would catch myself staring at Jake when I wasn't supposed to, noticing the way his jaw tensed when he was deep in thought, noticing the way his fingers tapped against the table when he was restless, noticing the way his eyes always found me, even when he tried not to look. I kept telling myself I wanted to erase that night from my mind, that I wanted to undo everything, to go back to the version of myself that existed before. But the truth? I didn't want to forget. I wanted to feel it again. And that was the real sin, wasn't it? Not the mistake itself. Not the act, but the hunger for it. I started questioning everything. Who I was. What I had become. Was I the villain in this story? Was I a terrible person, undeserving of forgiveness? Or was I just human? A woman who had been starved of affection for so long that she had lost herself in the first hint of being wanted again? I had spent years being unseen. Years fading into the background. Years watching my husband bury himself in work, in distractions, in anything but me. And now? Now, I had felt something that shook me awake. That rattled the cage I had been trapped in for so long. And part of me, a part one hated, a part one wanted to destroy, wasn't ready to let it go. The worst part? I didn't know if I could. So, now you know my story. Now you know the mistake I made. The moment of weakness that changed everything. The truth is, I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm someone worthy of forgiveness or if I'm just another person who let their emotions spiral out of control. And that's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been in a moment like this? A moment where you lost control, where emotions, desire, loneliness, need became louder than reason? Have you ever crossed a line you swore you never would? And if you have, did you regret it? Or was there some small part of you that still remembers why you did it? Because I think that's the part that haunts me the most. Not just the mistake itself. Not just the guilt. But the fact that, even now, even with all the shame, there's a part of me that doesn't want to forget. I need to know, am I alone in this? Tell me in the comments. I need to hear from you. I need to know if I'm the only one who has ever felt like this, or if there are others out there who understand. And if this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt trapped in a life that doesn't see you, in a love that has long since turned cold, then like this video. Like it if you believe that people deserve second chances. Like it if you believe that no one is perfect. And subscribe for more stories, real stories, that dive deep into the messy, complicated, and sometimes heartbreaking truth about love, temptation, and the choices that change us forever. Because if I've learned anything from this, it's that sometimes the biggest mistakes aren't the ones we make in a single moment. They're the ones we carry with us long after the moment has passed. Some mistakes fade with time. Others, they settle into your bones, become part of you, whisper to you in the quiet hours of the night when you think you've finally outrun them. I don't know which this will be. I don't know if, one day, I'll wake up and find that this guilt has dulled to nothing more than a distant ache, if it will become just another regret tucked away into the corners of my past. Or if this is the kind of mistake that never truly leaves. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how many mornings I wake up and tell myself that I am still the same person I was before this happened, I know I'm not. I know that something inside me has shifted. I look at myself in the mirror now, and I see a woman I don't quite recognize. A woman who has tasted something dangerous. A woman who has danced too close to a fire she was never meant to touch. And the worst part? I don't know if I regret it. I know I should. I should feel nothing but shame. I should wish with everything in me that I could go back, that I could undo it, that I could erase the moment I crossed that line. But there's another part of me, a part one can't ignore, no matter how much I try, that still clings to the memory. That still wants. And that's what haunts me most. Not just the betrayal, not just the guilt, but the undeniable truth that, for the first time in years, I felt alive. So, I have to ask, do you think true redemption is possible? Can a person come back from a mistake like this? Or are some lines unforgivable once they're crossed? Because if there's one thing I know for certain, it's this: no matter how much time passes, no matter what happens next, I will never be the same again.